Thank you for joining us this evening for the Pueblo Archaeological and Historical Society's program, Storytelling, Revitalization, and Cultural Continuity with Place. I'm Megan Wilbar, Museum Coordinator for the InfoZone Museum, and joining me, you'll see them right below, are Doug Baxter and Rebecca Wood. Doug is the president of the Pueblo Archaeological and Historical Society, and he's going to share a few words before we get to our program tonight. But first, I wanted to thank you from the library for both being with us this evening, and I'll turn it over to you, Doug.
Thank you, Megan. Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I would like to make a few announcements before I turn the program over to our guest speaker, Dr. Rebecca Wood. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the Pueblo City County Library District for continuing to support our programming. The library has graciously hosted speakers and events for us throughout the years, and we at the Pueblo Archaeological and Historical Society are fortunate to have not only their cooperation, but their technical expertise. I would also like to give a big shout out to Megan Wilbar for her help and patience. If you didn't know, I'd like to share the sad news about the passing of longtime Pueblo Archaeological and Historical Society member Tom Cummins. Tom was also a member of the Pueblo Historical Society, Heritage Museum, very active in the community, and he will be greatly missed. I'd like to announce a few events that are coming up for the Pueblo Archaeological Society. Our speaker, Thursday, November 5th, in conjunction with the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, will be renowned archaeologist Dr. Larry Lohendorf. His talk will be titled The Archaeology of Rock Art. There will be more details on this program in the next Archaeological Society newsletter, The Midden. Our December speaker, also in conjunction with Crow Canyon, will be Dr. Todd Surivel, head of the archaeology department at the University of Wyoming. Dr. Surivel specializes in the archaeology of hunter-gatherers and the first peoples of the New World. Also, watch for more details of this talk in the next newsletter, The Midden. For those who were thinking of signing up for the Hickland Springs and John Mountain Dam internal tour, unfortunately, I received an email Wednesday from the Army Corps of Engineers, and they are reevaluating all their events for 2020. And unfortunately, they have canceled everything until 2021. So there will be no Hickland Springs and John Martin Dam internal tour in October. I would like to invite everyone to participate in our next book discussion group. Monday, October 26th at 6:30, and this will more than likely be a virtual program also. We will feature the book Where the Spirits Ride the Wind, Trance Journeys and Other Ecstatic Experiences by Felidus D. Goodman. There will be more details on discussion format forthcoming. You can purchase this book at the Heritage Museum. I would like to mention that to our Pueblo Archaeological Society members that our January program will feature the ever-popular member presentations. If you've gone on an exotic vacation, done a summer project, or done something you would like to share with the members in a short 10 or 15-minute program, please contact myself or a Pueblo Archaeological Society board member. Lastly, besides the great speakers, I would also like to point out that the Pueblo Archaeological and Historical Society has many other opportunities and events open to its members. If you're not a member, check out our website or Facebook page for ways you can become a member, and also sign up for our newsletter, The Midden, that lists all the upcoming events and details. I'm going to cut that off about right there. I would now like to introduce Dr. Rebecca Wood. Dr. Wood is an instructor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. She is a linguistic anthropologist whose research focuses on understanding community language revitalization efforts in Native North America. More specifically, she is interested in the ways language embodies important sociocultural information and provides insight into how cultural groups deal with changing environments through the theoretical approaches of language socialization, language ideologies, and semiotics. Please welcome Dr. Rebecca Wood. And Rebecca, I would first like to ask you to define semiotics for our audience. I hope I said that right.
Absolutely.
Okay. So if
Yeah.
you give us the definition there, and thank you for coming. We appreciate it.
Sure, absolutely. Just very quickly, semiotics is the relationship between our different sign systems. So we can look at, say, language, which is a symbolic system, because it's made up of lots of different signs, and we can use that to try to figure out what else it can indicate about society. So it's really kind of a big arrow to the rest of society. So in a nutshell. All right. Well, first, I want to thank you all for the invitation to come speak with you all. And I also want to acknowledge the land that we're on. It is the unceded land of the Ute tribes, as well as the traditional land of the Apache, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Comanche, among others. And it's really important to acknowledge the land, especially as it relates to my given talk, because place and landscape is hugely important to Native tribes and the communities. And it's important to understand how the forced removal from these lands of these people really does continue to affect the communities that are present here today. And despite the continued efforts of the larger society to erase peoples from our histories and societies, these peoples continue to be extremely resilient, strong, and inspirational. And I often look to my own native or to my native peers within academia, specifically linguistic anthropology, such as Barb Meek, Jenny Davis, Gus Palmer, and especially within the Salish-Pend community whom I work with. And by no means this is all, but Patilik, Alex, Deepan, Milani, Cheney, Joshua, Linda, Cecchini, and Gary for really guidance, humility, and humor. So tonight I'm going to be talking about storytelling, revitalization, and cultural continuity with place. I look at storytelling as a form of reciprocity. It's a way of gift giving, really, and language is that gift. And it brings community together, it brings culture together, really as you interact with your landscape. And I am an avid outdoorist. I love to hike and climb. And so the outdoors is really important to me. But also as a researcher, I've come to really appreciate how vital that relationship to landscape can be in far as gift giving, building relationship, strength, and understanding. And I've also learned how landscape can really create a deeper sense of wellness for cultural and linguistic revitalization, but also in my own personal life. All right, so I want to start off this talk by really giving you a bit of background on, say, why we look at language. For me, language is inextricably tied to human culture. And as Doug noted, I really look at this semiotics, and I look to language as a way to help us understand the importance and the relationship we have to others. It helps us explain our daily practices and their perception about the world around us. Language can also shed light on the broader sociocultural issues and practices, and I hope throughout this talk that you'll really start to see how that is. And when we think about language, yes, I am a linguist, but it's also so much more than the grammatical systems. We can't abstract language totally from the speakers. And so it's important to contextualize everything we do with language to the broader sociocultural environment. And again, I focus on language as a symbolic system that is embedded within those sociocultural practices. So again, everything needs to be contextualized. And with language, it really can point to these arrows of larger societal ills, whatnot, benefits, all these things. So really quickly, I want to give you just a little background on language shift and revitalization. because that's central to my talk and to my work. So revitalization is the deliberate and conscious attempt by members of a culture to really reformulate culture and provide new meaning to it. There are many reasons why language shift has happened across the world. Languages are shifting more and more to predominant or very large language groups like English. So there's roughly 7,000 languages in the world, and unfortunately, we can talk about one every roughly 2 weeks, languages are disappearing. They're being eradicated for many reasons. Again, but this revitalization is a big push from the communities themselves to really reclaim their language, but then also because it's not just about language, it's about reclaiming their culture, their religion, their just daily economic practices and so forth. So this revitalization process is also very slow and continuous. So if you were to be able to bring back your language, that doesn't mean that it's secure for indefinite. So you're always going to be fighting against these larger social pressures, both internal with your community and external. And so things like media, for instance, that has a big impact. National beliefs can have a big impact, employment opportunities, and so forth. All the efforts of these revitalization and reclamation efforts are specifically driven by the community members themselves. As an academic, I contribute to their work, but I can scream till I'm red in the face of how I think things should go. But if they're not the ones driving it, it's not going to go anywhere, right? They have to want it for themselves. They have to do the work. And they are doing amazing things right now across the country and across the globe. And again, like I mentioned, language revitalization is so much more than just about the language, which I hope you'll see in the talk. So I've kind of created this little relationship diagram. So we can talk about revitalization at the core. So as you're revitalizing your language, you're bringing it back. You're trying to create new spaces for it. So maybe it's no longer just spoken in your home with your family, but maybe it's now spoken in the grocery store or in the playground or at the post office. Through that revitalization, you're also bringing about connections to the community. So you're kind of revitalizing the whole community itself. You're bringing back your cultural perspectives, your cultural beliefs, practices. And with that really comes, and I mean, one big part of it, which I'm going to talk about, is storytelling. But it also helps revitalize place and wellness and sustainability, because as you're bringing back the language, you're also bringing back core beliefs and ways to interact with your place and environment through maybe place names. But it's also having more awareness of the traditional plants, for instance, that you would have harvested and prepared, which then creates more wellness, which then helps heal the community and so forth. But when I talk about revitalization as kind of the core, it really is more about reciprocity. And what I mean by reciprocity is it's just this kind of collective ability, or just this gift-giving practice of where you're constantly feeding one another, right? And when I say one another, whether that's the animals, that's the plants, that's your fellow human beings, that's yourself, you're constantly going through this gift-giving process or reciprocity. And there's just a few different ways that Native groups talk about reciprocity. Some would call it the honorable harvest. So for instance, know the ways of ones who take care of you so that you may take care of them. Again, it's that relationship of gift giving back and forth. When we talk about the plants or even your fellow human beings, you introduce yourself. And how do you do that? Through the language. So that you're accountable as the one who comes asking for life. If you're going to ask permission before taking, And you're also going to abide by the answer. Never take the first, never take the last. So for instance, you don't want to go out and harvest a particular plant if it's the very first one you see, because maybe that's not really ready to be harvested yet. And likewise, you don't take the last, right? And so as you are, giving a gift in reciprocity for what you have taken, it's really a whole different worldview perspective when we talk about this reciprocity. And so if we think about language and revitalization as a gift, we can start to see the benefits, not just for Native communities, but also for the larger public, right? And again, because it's sustaining the ones who sustain you, and the earth will last forever. So again, what does language have to do with the landscape? Well, landscape is often shaped by our experiences. And talking to many archaeologists, I'm sure you can relate to this. And just being on the land and having those experiences really does change who we are. Really, and it creates a sense of well-being. It's a mental, physical health. And if we look to Keith Basso, a linguistic anthropologist who focused predominantly on language in the landscape, he says the shapes and colors and contours of the land, together with the shifting sounds and cadences of native discourse, thrust themselves upon the newcomer with a force so vivid and direct as to virtually inescapable. So what he's getting at is, as you are interacting with the landscape, you're also often communicating with those around you, whether it is your fellow humans or your fellow animals or plants or whatever. You really start to have an impression on you, as then it has an impression as well back and forth, right? We can talk about, again, ways to connect maybe through some basic questions if we're looking specifically at the landscape, or how I might look at them, right, or ask them. So how are landscape features selected as nameable objects? Why do we choose to name X, Y, or Z that thing? Right? Why do we feel that we need to actually name it? Right? How are landscapes interpreted and categorized? Right? And with this, how does language then reflect the worldview perspective? What can we learn from viewing these that are interrelated and cross-cultural and cross-linguistic? So again, language is a way for us to interact with the world around us and come to understand it. We can talk about traditional ecological knowledge, or how do certain Native individuals have this plethora of long-lasting knowledge of when to harvest particular plants and how to harvest them in the proper way. Why do you tell traditional stories? What moral values and ethics and just ways of being in the world can that tell us just by simply evoking a landscape? You also, with connecting to the landscape, you often are going out and with your peers and interacting with the landscape. And so it is a way to form community. It's also a discussion with the earth. Right? Again, thinking as you're out there, you might not actually be vocalizing anything through language, but you are having that connection. So I want to have you think about this a little bit. So as with language, the landscape can't be understood in isolation. So there's a whole social construct around, say, a particular landscape and how you interact with it. As an archaeologist, you are going to interact very differently than I would as a linguist, or even as, say, a climber. I love to go hiking with my archaeologist friend because she's constantly staring down at the rocks or at the ground, and I'm constantly staring up at the walls to be climbed. We can also think about, the plants or the animals or even specific cultural groups, which we'll talk about in a second. But when you see this image, right, this conjures up a particular notion, right? That's Mount Rushmore, if you don't realize that. But thinking about this place is actually, or has very different meaning if you were going as, say, a tourist, as opposed to, say, a Lakota, Dakota, Nakota individual who views this site as a very sacred entity, right? Who has been desecrated by individuals and have these figures plastered across them. So when you go to a place, you are going to have a different interaction depending on what you call it, who is there, and so forth. Similarly, we can think about very here locally, the Garden of the Gods. Again, you are going to have a different construct with it than if you were, say, a Ute individual who would come here again and view this as a sacred site. And whether we look at, say, the Garden of the Gods as one singular entity, or if we broaden it and start to view Garden of the Gods as one singular place on a larger landscape of ways to travel and connect with other individuals of, say, the tribal peoples, right? And this is really helpful to look at as archaeologists, rather than just a singular field site, but how all those different field sites within Colorado or even, Western United States are interconnected, right? And really the people's sense of the place, whether you're talking about the Ute or the Lakota or even us, or, with these tribal people, their tribal past and their vibrant sense of themselves today are inextricably intertwined. And that's why it's been so impactful for the removal of these people to lose that sense of place, because place is everything for them. Right? So here I have just a broad map of some of the different anthropological groupings that we like to put Native tribes into. So I focus on the plateau area up towards the northwestern coast in that kind of brownish color, right? The plateau is a really useful tool for us to help understand how groups share common similarities in cultural practices, beliefs, religion, economics, and so forth. But also we see that there are, and you're not going to be able to read those names, but we can also group individual tribal peoples by their linguistic categories. So I work with the Columbia Plateau, but I also work with primarily the Salish-Pend, which is in that orange color. So that has far different reaches than just, say, looking at the Columbia Plateau. And so it's important to kind of consider where people exist, but also how they exist with one another across these different boundaries or landscapes that we put forth. So talking a little bit specifically about my work, so I work with the Salish-Pend, or the preferred name, their tribal names are the Salish and Salish-Pend, language and culture. So that is a group in Western Montana. It's in the circle there. The majority of these individuals do reside on the Flathead Indian Reservation. But of course, there are lots of populations all over the place. There is a tribal enrollment of about 6,500 individuals. And the reservation is made up of the Salish, the Bitterroot Salish, the Salish-Pend with a Kalispel, as well as a language isolate in a slightly different cultural group, the Kootenai, as well as a predominantly white population. There's about 28%, or they make up of only 28% of the population. The native culture makes that up. So they are the minority on their own reservation. Their traditional lands spanned really as far down into Idaho, to the south, and pretty far east into Montana, but were of course pushed west when we had the big colonization. So unfortunately, of that population of 6,500 individuals, there are fewer than 20 fluent speakers remaining of the Salish language. This specific one, it's part of a larger branch that again stretches up into Washington and British Columbia. but there's fewer than 20 speakers left. And that number has dwindled. When I first started working in the community in 2007, there are over 65 speakers. So drastic numbers are dropping. And so that's why it's been super crucial to create these revitalization efforts. And tying the language to place and to culture, for the Salish-Pend, it's really critical to invoke a sense of place and who you are. It helps you understand your footing, your community, your relations, and so forth. And for every place that you see, this would be a little bit further south of, say, the Flathead Reservation. They have a specific place name and a story to go with those place names. So, and a little bit later, I'm going to talk about this one clear down at the bottom with, it's called Ch'aya. It's the place where the ram got his head stuck. And so, again, every place you go invokes a story. And this is really important because even though they're no longer on the reservation, they still have historical evidence of them going back to these places just through oral traditions and place names alone. All right, so the revitalization efforts currently ongoing with the Salish. First of all, they started back in the 1970s when they realized there was going to be, or there was quite a bit of language shift to the English language. So they have created an immense amount of work. They have an Inkuzum, which is a Salish immersion school. That's K-12, or say K through 8. You can take the language and cultural classes kind of as electives as you go beyond that in the different school districts. But again, remember, these are run mostly by the majority dominant population. There's adult language learning programs where you can go get your teaching and education as well as ability to teach the language and culture. There's language apps, but I can't stress enough the amount of work that they have put into these efforts. And while the numbers continue to shrink, they're also creating this cohort of speakers who are not fluent, but they're working really hard to become fluent. So I don't know if you can see that. It might be a bit small for you all, but I choose to work for this particular project on storytelling, because storytelling provides a key socialization tool for cultural and moral developments of individuals. Because after all, language is a social interaction, right? It's inherently social. And so it's not just a means by which we act upon the social world. Speaking itself is a form of social action. And so language is a cultural resource available for people to use. And so if they're going to reclaim their language and bring it back, storytelling is a really great conduit to do that. So for this project, I primarily documented SME narratives, which are kind of like news or reporting stories. And not the Skolumt narratives, because the Skolumt are the traditional stories. And first of all, those are often very sacred, and they are not to be told to the larger public, especially at different times of the year. And so, and we're not even in quite the storytelling months yet. And so when I reference some of these stories in a moment, I'm not going to give the story because it's not appropriate at that time. So these stories create a more detailed and nuanced understanding of the language, culture, and individual creativity. So what happens often within linguistics is, or even just place names, we write down the place names or we analyze the language and then we say we're done. But what analyzing storytelling gives us is an insight into how there's so much individual creativity, right? And it also gives us insight into the important aspects of a given culture what their preferences are, what are their worldview perspectives. And it really gives the speaker opportunities and listeners to construct the nature and reality around them, and give the listener insight into some of these larger worldview perspectives of the culture. So we can also begin to understand the ways in which Salish cultural beliefs, morals, and practices are conveyed and transformed through the storytelling practice. Because as you're sitting around discussing these stories, you're also imparting this wisdom. You're imparting this cultural knowledge. You're creating a sense of community, in which really, again, the key of the talk will create this reciprocity and relationship to those around you, including the landscape. So there's the picture. When it comes to storytelling, again, it is a form of reciprocity, and it's history's in the making, because yes, it's important to say in this image, is how Chipmunk got his stripes. It is really important to know how the animals were created, how they interact, how we should interact with them. But the storytelling I'm looking at really gives a sense of how we can create the world around us today, right? And connect us to those ancestors of past, right? Because we don't want to always talk about Native communities and what was and what could have been, but use that knowledge to push forward into today. And so we can start to get insight into how people are dealing with some of these issues of our day-to-day lives. So connects people with the landscapes. And this is really critical, because when you are telling a story, so often you are telling a story about a place. And this is especially true with the Salish narratives that I've recorded. It's a very common thing for them to talk about the landscape and how they've interacted with them. And again, there's moral lessons, as well as really medicinal value in these landscapes. And so it's not just that you can go out and find particular plants that are really beneficial for healing or that will feed your family, but it's also part of the process of just simply going out into the landscape and interacting with it as you're telling these stories. Right? Storytelling has long been an important site for the transmission of traditional cultural and moral values. And so by analyzing and sharing the narratives of these traditional stories, one might find the healing and cultural value of connecting people with the landscape. So part of the larger scope of this project, in collaboration with the tribe, is to, again, connect the individuals to their environment, wellness, and healing. Because in past research, that's time and time again what individuals have said was their biggest desire for the community, is to create this healing. And again, to connect the landscape and kind of put away technology a little bit so we can go back to knowing who we are. And with that, with the storytelling and with a little bit of linguistic analysis, individuals start to really understand how morphologically descriptive the language is, and how it's very flexible language. And it really does start to shape how you view the world around you. So for instance, the word for water in Salish is selhwa, and it doesn't mean you can't do a direct translation. It's not just water. It means to ask something for healing, for forgiveness, for purification. So whenever you go to the water, it's almost like a prayer. And so if you think about it like that and you understand the meaning behind that specific word, you start to get a sense of, how you might interact with the world around you. You're probably not going to be polluting into that water source if you're going to ask for healing. Right? And so this project also tries to help engage students outside of the classroom. Because language, there's so few speakers, by default, most of the revitalization efforts have become in the classroom. And we want to get kids outside of the classroom or adults outside of the classroom and interacting with others, and so to almost normalize the language, so that you can say or greet somebody in the grocery store and say, in the Salish language. So here's a lot of linguistic analysis. So I just want to kind of highlight very briefly, this is a particular narrative. I pulled just an excerpt from it. This narrative, this older gentleman who has since passed away is discussing a particular place, that there's parts where the families used to come and camp there, and collect, particular berries or plants, and sometimes they would hunt. There's also parts of it, this landscape, that are very sacred. And so I haven't included any of that part, but he goes on to discuss why it's sacred and why it matters specifically. But I just wanted to show you a little bit about how explanative the language is, or descriptive, I should say, the language can be, and how flexible it is, with just a few little excerpts here. So, all right, so if we look at this first line, say 46, the first line is how you would just write it. And the second line is the actual morphological breakdown. So that, and when I say morpheme, those are the smallest meaningful units of a language. So if we take the word like drawing a blank, cats. We'll just do an easy one, cats. Cat has two morphemes, so cat, right? And then the plural S, and we can connect those two, right? Because that S means plural, right? Or we can say he runs, that S becomes then the action of the running, or the tense marker. So this language is very different than English. It's a polysynthetic, which means that they put lots and lots of morphemes together to form a word, right? And each word or root has a lot of meaning. So chimi, which means only, unech, te'u l'salk, which is, this word is summer, she teshlach, which is serviceberry. That's a type of plant that you collect. It's not the same as a cranberry or a huckleberry, but similar if you were to look in the wild. Sheka pachmilt, so that's to be a lesson. Right, so ushek sult, necho poets kone, te echle ulech. So he's talking about when he was a kid, he used to come to this place and to fetch water. Also, it was summertime, and so it was serviceberry time. And so that was a really good lesson, or it was really important time to collect those berries. But it was also a really important time to learn that there were rattlesnakes in the area. And so you had to be very mindful of that. And so in this little excerpt, one, you can see that ulet or ulech means a rattle in the earth. So the earth rattles, but it really means the rattlesnake. Okay, so it can be very descriptive. So for instance, the word for car is pipoishin, which means wrinkled feet, because that's the marks that the tires left in the pavement or the dirt. But here, the speaker is really starting to invoke the memories he had when it's here. It's also invoking a lesson that when it's serviceberry time, that is also the time when the rattlesnakes come out. So you have to be very careful of that. And then he goes on to reminisce about the time he got into deep with the rattlesnakes and the lessons he learned from that. So in this little excerpt, it's invoking this whole story and this whole morality lesson, and also linked to the landscape. And it also shares a little bit of specifically the individual speaker variation in how he talks. Right? So with storytelling, revitalization, and cultural continuity to place, this has become really important and a means by which the tribe has figured out and determined that they want to proceed with a really useful way to help bring back both the language, the culture, and even connection to landscape. And we'll see food sovereignty eventually. So in the first image here, we see a woman. She is going through the process of cleaning what's called bitterroot. And there's a really important story that goes with this. And we know that there are very specific times of the year to collect this. And you have to perform the first collection of the bitterroot in a very specific manner. And you have to prepare it in a specific manner to ensure that that food source, which is provided for the bitterroot Salish, and hence comes the name, for millennia. And so it's really important to, again, ensure that it continues going on. And again, there's a very specific story that goes with that spectrum. Likewise, with the canoe, this is a really cool scenario where they have actually, that was the first time they have created a dugout canoe and placed it on the Flathead Lake in over 100 years. So they went through that entire process to find the cedar and clean it out and treat it and all of those things. And they relied on those traditional stories to be able to do that with the stichlum. And then this picture on the right-hand side, this is the chkaya. That's the place where they get the ram's head stuck. And we call that the medicine tree. And that's, they continue to make biannual journeys. They used to be able to grow in big groups, but unfortunately, because of COVID, now they have to make small individual trips. But this place, there's an entire story around how this place came to be and really how this place was really important, kind of pre-human time, to pass it on. It's also a really important time historically for numerous reasons, but they continue to make that journey today for a place of healing and wellness. So part of this process with the storytelling and connection to landscape and revitalization, it's, again, not just about creating a revitalization of the language, but it also creates a further connection with the place, with culture, and again, thinking about this whole process of reciprocity and gift giving that you can really get out of this. And it's always important to look ahead. So much of the work that I've been doing with this landscape and data collection has been affected by COVID, but it's really amazing the resiliency that these tribal people have had with dealing with COVID, first of all, but also with their own efforts to bring back and create this kind of sovereignty again. So again, the connection broadly, it's bringing about cultural revitalization and practices. That's why we refer to many of these youth in particular as the 7th and 8th generation, because they are the ones that are bringing about the major changes. Food sovereignty has become extremely important. This young woman here on the bottom, she has done amazing work to really bring back food sovereignty and traditional food practices and returning to the stories of place. And so understanding that is a huge part of the language, because knowing how to collect things, prepare them, and share them is very much embedded in the language. And community wellness and reclamation, it really is about this whole entire process of creating betterment for all those around us. And a huge part of this is looking at the type of research we do with these communities. And so thinking about, moving forward and what you can take away from this talk, a huge part of the ability for me as an outsider to come into this community and be able to collaborate or work with them and do the research I do is because of, again, that humility and the ability to listen to what they want and take my knowledge and to help them achieve those particular goals. So it's them really leading the way and just me offering my resources to help support them in their work. And then as an outsider too, I get to enjoy many of the benefits of the beautiful landscape for which they live. And so I'm very thankful for that. So that is all I have. So I will say Lem Lem Shahoy.